Okay, good afternoon or good morning if you're joining us early from
Mm.
the west coast of the US. And as one of our presenters is, it's a very early start for them. Thank you, Anthony, for joining us so early. My name is David Mills. This is the second of our new series of our CGHE webinars for the autumn and the academic year just beginning now. And it's a real pleasure, as always, to welcome really interesting research being done in higher education. And today we have a collective presentation, which is really interesting, with Joshua Brown from Johns Hopkins, Antonio from Stanford, and Chinhui Kim from Johns Hopkins as well. And also this paper, I think, has been written by Thomas Cowett at Glasgow. And they're going to be talking about the global evolution of higher education accountability, um, a social network analysis of the scholarly literature. And this, for me, is a really important topic because it's helping us think methodologically about how we track and understand the emergence of ideas in the literature. And and I think you've all got a really interesting approach to reminding us that literatures are dynamic and evolve, and we need to attend to the temporal dimension of that in thinking about how ideas get taken up, and that sometimes our literature review approaches are just a bit too static. So hopefully this is both methodologically useful for people interested in studying higher education, but also the question of accountability is a really substantive topic for us all as well. So with no further ado, I'll hand over to Joshua, Antonio, and Jinri. The screen's all yours, and if you could take half an hour or so, and then we'll have lots of time for questions as well. And if you have questions along the way, anyone, please do just put your questions in the chat. As always, we're recording this, and we will make this available on our website tomorrow, so you can always come back to it at some point, along with the slides. Great, it's all yours, Joshua.
Wonderful. I will start us off. Thank you, David. Thank you, everyone, for attending our little talk here. Good morning. On behalf of Josh, Tom, and Sheeny, I want to thank the Center for Global Higher Education for hosting us in this talk today. Today, we'd like to share some research in progress. We're still working on this. The origin story to this work revolves around my colleague, Josh Brown, who's the leader on this project. Josh was the editor of the journal Research and Practice in Assessment. When he reached out to me to serve on the editorial board a number of years ago, we will say, I was beginning to dabble in social network analysis, and he was finishing a defining article on accountability in higher education. A few conversations over the years, and this project was born. So together with Thomas Cowett from Glasgow and Sheeny Kim from Hopkins, we're sharing a social network approach to examining the accountability literature in higher education. Next slide. And we position our work alongside quote-unquote traditional literature reviews, which are valuable readings and renderings of a corpus of knowledge for researchers. Some of these approaches found in the accountability literature include the following. A most traditional approach identifies a knowledge domain, and the analyst conducts the search, typically with the goal of identifying substantive topic areas based upon their prevalence in the literature. A primary objective is identifying what is not covered and what novel knowledge problems are ripe for study. The Schindler piece, Definitions of Quality in Higher Education, orients and analyzes the literature in this way, offering conclusions about the different ways quality has been defined. Some reviews undertake a specific question in their analysis of the literature, such as Tracing Accountability in Higher Education, which focuses on the relationship between the understandings of accountability and changes in the higher education landscape. Or a review might focus on a single community or association of scholars, such as Harvey and Williams' review of articles published in the journal Quality in Higher Education. Next slide. There are some limitations to these traditional approaches. The first is this is typically done by hand, or should I say by the straining eyes of the researcher across hundreds and hundreds of articles. One consequence of that is that many reviews largely ignore the temporal aspects of knowledge development, instead treating knowledge as static and lumped into discrete topical areas first and foremost. There are exceptions, as we've seen, but a more typical handling of time is using it to limit the literature to a particular publication window. Otherwise, there are just too many articles to consider. A second limitation is that traditionally, literature reviews are conducted to identify quote-unquote gaps in the literature, those unanswered questions that reside in the literature. This objective can obscure influential actors and ideas in an area simply because they are associated with a well-populated topic. We will see an example of this later in our presentation. Lastly, analyses of focused subareas, often grouped by keywords and abstracts or titles, may appear to put authors in the same discussion room, so to speak, which may or may not actually reflect their knowledge and use of others' work. Next slide. My colleague Josh offered another approach reflective of his expertise in organizational sociology. He reasoned that discourse and understanding of accountability was an organizational phenomenon and employed institutional logics to systematize literature into what he calls 7 silos of accountability. The novelty here is that he assumes that there are knowledge communities that take up common understandings and practices of accountability that may differ from others. Next slide. Although the insight of knowledge communities was an important step forward, particularly for a knowledge area inhabited by researcher, practitioner, policymaker, and state actors, this work retained some blind spots as well. First, it was US-centric, potentially ignoring important knowledge communities. It remained temporally static in its approach. And as a US-centric analysis, its interpretations were culturally biased with taken for granted American conceptions of accountability and assessment. Next slide. Observing this, we have been exploring MMSNA, a mixed method social network analysis approach to analyzing literature. MSNA typically involves the use of descriptive network statistics or modeling to identify non-random or network structures of interest. Researchers use this quantitative data of whole networks to identify select nodes and edges for further exploration, which in the case of a co-citation network analysis directs the exploration of qualitative data within a corpus of literature. We used a triad census to identify a particular type of triad that signals a shared reference between articles in a co-citation network. Next slide, please. We're missing a slide. The triad census is there. Okay. Triad census triad it consists of articles that are linked together by a shared reference. And the shared reference is the connection, or what we might think of the structure that indicates a conversation between articles. And in this way, moving from sort of isolate articles to an emerging community. Next slide. Here we are. And so here with an MSSNA, we are moving from discrete domains of knowledge to knowledge communities, from static ideas to an evolution of ideas using a longitudinal view, and from autonomous actors to relational actors. Next slide. Now with mixed methods social network analysis, the co-citation networks, the advantages here, they illustrate authorial relationships through references in common. We now have the ability to empirically derive communities relationally linked in a knowledge space by creating these linkages through the co-citations. The linked connections are now observed, and they're observed in context through the qualitative data, looking into the articles themselves. With this longitudinal approach, we can see the growth of knowledge communities observed over time. That brings us to our research question. What can we learn about the scope and evolution of higher education accountability through the analytical lens of knowledge communities? Next slide. So here's our data corpus and how we organized our search of articles. So we looked from 1974 to 2017 using sort of the requisite search engines. I won't go into too much detail here, but this in the end resulted in a corpus of 2,991 articles. The inclusion criteria was focusing on accountability in the title of abstracts. Then we used a process to funnel down those articles, leaving us with a final corpus of 450 articles, and importantly, also collecting each of the references in those articles, which amounted to over 12,000 references. Next slide. So here's the general course of our methodology, our mixed methods methodology. We start by generating the co-citation network with those 450 articles and 12,000 references. Phase 2 is when we empirically define or empirically identify the knowledge communities by partitioning the entire network into communities. In the next phase, we partition by time. And for this particular set of articles, we used policy occurrences and created 5-year panels. So we split the corpus by 5-year panels. And then from there is when we investigate the structures in each of the panels, after embedding the qualitative content from the different articles and examine them. And then we can sequence them to interactive displays, which we'll show you an example of that facilitates this investigation of the qualitative content. Next slide. So now I'm going to show you just a brief glimpse of the methodology before I hand it over to Josh for the results. So here we see on the left, this is the full co-citation network. So you see the articles, which are in light blue, and the references, and it's quite a bugger of a ball. You'll see that it's mostly purple because there are so many references. And then what we did is we filtered the network to include only nodes, which are the references or the articles that have at least 2 connections to them. This is in network analysis, a total degree greater than 1. And so these then only include those nodes that have some connection to another. We have a much smaller network now, 1,500 articles and references, but it's still quite large and difficult to visualize. So next slide, please. So our next step then is to empirically derive the knowledge communities. We do so by using community detection techniques that essentially identify groups of nodes that are mathematically more connected to each other than to any other community. We ran different models, in other words, different community detection methods, and found this Libyan method to be the one to provide the most distinctive communities. And we found 24 communities in this way. Next slide. So here's an abbreviated list of those communities, now with names based upon our reading of the articles in each community. We dropped some of the communities because they were too small, typically just 2 or 3 articles. That's the next slide. And then if you can go to the next slide, you will see that as we looked at the communities, we noticed that many were also defined by the origin of their journals, primarily American or international, and identified those as international communities or American communities. So today we'll share our analysis of just 4 of these communities, and I'll hand it over to Josh.
Thank you, Anthony. It's nice to see everyone this afternoon, this morning, wherever you might be. For the latter half of this presentation, Sheeny and I are going to take you into these 4 communities, 5, 9, 14, and 17. And we've chosen these primarily because they are diverse in this way. I'm going to start with community 5. I'm going to take you down in and show you what's going on inside of all of these nodes. Sheeny's going to take over 9 and 14 and explain what the international communities are doing and their phenomenon, and then I'll take it back over and show you another distinct U.S. phenomenon. And each of these clusters is going to show a radically different dialogue that's happening. And so this is sort of the, we're getting into the qualitative component of our MMSNA, or our mixed methods aspect. Earlier, you heard Anthony tell you that as part of our methods, once we identified the communities, he used the word partition and policy panels. And we broke these up into 5-year increments from pre-1992 all the way to 2017, which is the end of our database. And this is sort of what happens when you divide up that hairball. And you can start to see that as at the front end, the discussion or the references are more sparse in some communities, and they explode or wane in some instances in others. But this is what's going on in Community 5. Community 5 centers on what's called performance-based funding. The structure here, you'll note in red, we call this incremental evolution. This is the traditional developmental approach of a community, where, as you saw previously, it grows incrementally over time. In this instance, PBF is what it's known as, performance-based funding. It's a US policy phenomenon where state level funding is tied to college and university level outcomes. It can be retention, it can be graduation, it can be all sorts of different completion or metric items that specific state, whether it's California or New York, determines to be successful. So these policies differ by states. And these researchers are trying to get their heads around this here. You'll see that the articles focus on state accountability generally early on, as well as the data system that these institutions are trying to navigate within their specific states. That bottom bullet there that I want to highlight is that this centers on PBF 2.0, which basically there's an early version of performance-based funding in the 70s and 80s, centering around the state of Tennessee mostly. Around the early 2000s, it starts to resurface. And you see this community develop through books and policy documents. I'll go back here. So we're in panel 2, and I'm going to zoom in on panel 2. Here you see instances where these blue dots here, they're not just articles, but they're actually books and government reports. It's not until later on that the academics start to come in and become part of this conversation. So this early ring here of interconnectivity really does focus on a number of books and reports by organizations, specifically the SHEO organization, SHEEO an executive organization. As this advances, you start to see the scholars take more of a investigative approach, and they start to shift the outcomes and the examination of the outcomes over time, where they're no longer looking just at completion, but they're also looking at retention and other success metrics. And they start to tie this toward the end of the database. Here in panel 5, what you start to see at the end is the scholars in that community take the discussion toward political parties. What they're interested in by the end of this conversation, at the end of this development, is in the American system, are there differential outcomes based on Republican or Democrat controlled state systems? And that's sort of the dominant discourse occurring in this community over time and how it evolves. That's the US centric one. Now I'd like to show you an international one here. Shini?
Thank you, Josh. So, hi, my name is Shini, and I will present about 2 communities which are international contexts. So, firstly, Community 9 is titled as a comparative perspective of accountability. So, as you can see, the trends throughout the panel, it emerged in panel 2 and then started to grow until panel 5. Can you? So the structure of Community 9 can be defined as persistent diffusion, as the articles are diffused geographically. It is an international community that uses comparative frameworks to examine accountability trends at macro level, mostly focusing on nations or systems. Although it examines national level of higher education, it is rooted in academic discourse where academic references play a pivotal role. So reports by governments and organizations can be found in this community, but do not stand out as a reference that ties the articles together, especially across panels. Early panels are concentrated in European countries, as articles in earlier panels are mostly about higher education accountability system in Western European countries, but it becomes more geographically diverse in later panels as later developed or developing countries attempt to adopt accountability system, including South Africa, China, Kazakhstan, Nigeria, and Pakistan. So articles studying later developed countries or developing countries are connected to articles studying earlier articles studying Western European countries by referring to earlier work on accountability of higher education and comparing their systems or adopting their frameworks. So this is an international community that does not include US-centered articles or references, but still shows the flow of global higher education accountability system. Can you move to the next slide? Thank you. So this reference was highlighted because it shows how the context where the reference was used is about national higher education system. So articles view accountability in a macroscopic perspective instead of individual student assessment and evaluation. So in other communities where individual student assessment, in other communities, individual student assessments or student learning is highlighted. However, in this community, it is not highlighted that much because it's looking at macro level higher education. So national and transnational analysis are conducted and transmission of trends in accountability of higher education is highlighted, especially from developed to developing countries. Can you move to the next slide, please? And the next community is Community 14, and we titled it the Politics of Accountability. This is also an international community, and this community emerged in panel 0, and then it was absent for a while and then re-emerged from panel 2. It exploded in panel 4 and then shows a sudden decrease in volume in panel 5. The structure of this community is peak to pullback as it had its peak in panel 4 and then to be pulled back in panel 5. Slide, please. Yes. So it is an international community that begins in early 2000s with the emergence of a new audit logic that emphasizes quality assurance. In this community, books and government reports are common bridges or ties between articles, unlike the previous community, Community 9. And also 2 references written by Power, the Audit Explosion published in 1994 and the Audit Society published in 1997, serve as a thread throughout the community. So these references stay across panels, bridging articles across panels from 2 to 5. So while the earlier articles and references are centered around audit, later conversation is focused more on globalization and neoliberalism. They address the different stakeholders and power struggle among them with globalization and neoliberalism in higher education. So that's why we titled this community as the politics of accountability. Also, geographically, the studies moved from Western countries such as the United States, UK, and Australia to later developed or developing countries such as Jamaica, Mexico, South Africa, Hong Kong, Singapore, and China. Next slide, please. As mentioned earlier, while references by Power, which are about audit system, were popularly quoted in earlier panels, in later panels, like panel 4 and 5, 3 new books enter as conceptual anchors. So the visual shows how the reference by Power tied the articles in panel 3 together. And in panel 4 and 5, these 3 books, Universities and Marketplace by Bach, Academic Capitalism by Slaughter and Rhodes, and the Enterprise University by Marginson and Considine, were predominantly cited, and these are about neoliberalism and capitalism of higher education. And we could also see there is also a shift from earlier logics, which is macro level, to later strategies to micro level.
Thanks, Sheeny. Excellent. So our last community is 17, and we've labeled this low stakes testing and assessment. What we've been doing is drilling down further into each community to get to that qualitative component, which allows us to offer you the meaning or the interpretation of the meaning for each community. This specific community, 17, it has an explosive expansion. It's pretty much non-existent for the earlier panels. And even in panel 3, you see that there's only 1 article here in the center with a lot of references. In panel 4, shortly after the Great Recession, as well as the launch of what's in the United States, what's called the Spellings Report in 2006, this community explodes. This community, it's also US-centric. The difference in this one is that it focuses on low stakes testing, not high stakes testing, which are the admissions tests like SATs, ACTs, GREs, LSATs. What's going on here with the low stakes assessment is that the Spellings Report called for institutions to be able to measure what's called value added. In order to measure the value added, policymakers took a keen interest in the psychometric scholars who were already measuring learning. And for the interest of student improvement, for student outcomes. And so what you see here in this 4th bullet is the tension between 2 interpretations of accountability and the uses of these tests. Was it assessment for accountability or was it assessment for improvement? And this tension is maintained throughout the final 2 panels when this community explodes. You'll see the 2 halves of this. On the left side of this picture, you're going to see these individuals over here focused on quality assurance, and these individuals over here, the psychometricians, focused on student learning. These normally would be two separate views, completely unrelated to one another, if it wasn't for these 6 references, these 6 individuals, these 6 bridges that are spanning this chasm, that are capturing the two sides, whether it's assessment for accountability or assessment for improvement. And these 6 articles, and this is the value of the 021U triads, that we use here. That what you're looking at is a screenshot, but if I were to hover my cursor over this specific line or this specific line, it calls out an actual quote from the reference itself that allows us to interpret the meaning going on between those two edges and nodes. So some big takeaways here. What we've been able to highlight with this methodology are a few things. And again, we welcome your feedback here shortly on this. One of the big takeaways is that we've been able to highlight the role of government in catalyzing both national and international knowledge communities. So for example, in Community 17, you can see that it is literally catalyzed by the Spellings report out of the Department of Education in the United States. But more importantly, and we've published a little bit of this already in a scientometrics piece last year, what this allows us is a method for tracing the development of any idea, not just accountability, but it could be any sort of social phenomenon that you are interested in and that you want to use to trace over time. Maybe it's testing, maybe it's high stakes testing, maybe it's some sort of teacher education topic or some sort of international topic related to education or even sociology in general. Third, we offer a first of its kind map of higher education accountability globally. I thought when I had written the 7 silos piece back in 2017, I thought it was a great advancement. And when I had approached Anthony to sort of test this, as we started to pull down the data, it became very apparent I was only thinking with a US set of eyes. Almost half of the data in this database is beyond the United States or Western nations. And I completely had to rethink that early and initial model. Fourth, we offer some strategies that future scholars or sectors might consider. You can see what impact looks like as those ideas spread over time. And then finally, we can highlight the blind spots. The community that Sheeny offered about comparative and the politics of accountability, there was nothing equivalent in the database that was US or Western centric. And so this offers sort of a new vein of scholarship that those of us in the US really ought to look beyond our borders to look for how we might be thinking about and advancing our own work, because that often that discourse is the other way around, unfortunately. So please reach out to any of us. Here's our email addresses. You can find us all on social media as well. We would love to connect, but at this time, I'll turn it over to David for some Q&As. Let me go ahead and hit pause. Mike, thanks, David.
Great. Well, thank you all, Anthony, Joshua, and Shinri, for really helpful and thoughtful set of reflections on how we do literature reviews and how we might do them differently, and on how we think about a debate and how we try and get beyond the silos that we identify through this mixed method social network approach. So I guess an immediate reaction from a sort of Latourian perspective would be, well, are these really communities or are they sort of rivalries? I mean, you're using the word community to basically mean co-citation network, aren't you? Yeah.
We are.
God, yeah. Is that overreading something into these networks of citation?
I wouldn't say it's an overreading. If we didn't have the qualitative components, if we didn't have the ability to dive in more deeply and see the differences in meaning and interpretation, in some instances on specific words, or in other instances about actual instruments that are being used by the various communities. I think I might say, you know what, you have a really valid point. I need to rethink that, but I actually might defend that these are legitimate communities. Anthony, you have some additional thoughts?
No, I mean, I think it's a fair question if we, have a sort of generic idea of what community means. In early network analysis, folks were connected if they were co-present, right, in the same room. If we think about the early studies, and the proxy for that, right, is being in conversation by citing another scholar and referencing in the text. So again, these are citations and not reference lists. And as Josh said, I think because we are looking closely at how those citations are used, that we consider them to be sort of in conversation. And then when linked together through those common citations, it is as if they are in conversation with each other. And it certainly comports with the way, many scholars do engage literature in their work.
Yeah, no, I think I accept it. I was just sort of interested in what resonance community has. But I think you're right. I mean, I remember being very sort of blown away by some of Michael Power's work when I first read it in the 1990s. And your Community 14 absolutely captures how that work was taken up, particularly by anthropologists of audit and accountability. And you're right that created what was it in a European initially conversation, UK particularly, but then across other forms of social democracy in Europe. And it didn't feel such a US conversation, perhaps because of the model of a more sort of diverse US HE system and less sort of attempts at state accountability. Whereas, of course, in the UK, we've had the research assessment exercises since the early mid 1980s almost. First one 1991 formally, but so there's a long history of attempts at using sort of new public management to shape higher education sort of strategies. So yeah, so I do get it, and I absolutely identify with that sense of Community 14 being a community. And I guess the only other thing that occurred to me before I sort of get other people to join in this conversation is that a word like accountability clearly has a lot of different meanings and connotations. I guess you could have gone into this manually by saying, well, I'm only interested in accountability in relation to another keyword, so that would be how a keyword search would sort of approach this. You'd have accountability and something, yeah. But what you've done by keeping it open, I imagine also perhaps the technique itself allows you to see all the different uses of the word accountability. So my question then is, are there ever moments where the communities come together? Because you've got these communities that are sort of, you're identifying as separate. Do they ever sort of join up and the conversation become, joined together? I mean, or is that harder to see in the model you've used?
Well, in the technique that we use to identify the communities, that's less easy to see.
Right.
So we identify the communities by looking by collapsing them all over time, right? And so what we're seeing are the resultant communities in that sense. We are able to see how those now empirically defined communities are linked by articles or references. So they are not, like in network terms, they are not completely isolated, right, from each other. There are connections between them as well. And that, could be an indicator of some sort of, crosstalk or cross-fertilization, which we haven't looked into as yet, but have noticed how they're connected in those kinds of ways. I think it's now become quite interesting to see that in the context of seeing international or at least regionally based kinds of communities. So two things that we've noticed, for example, are there are some topics that are resident in an American community that aren't, like performance-based funding, in a European or Western European community. And there are a couple that are shared, but remain regionally distinct. For example, teacher accountability. And so there may be some crosstalk there. So we don't have that ability to see coalescence. We would need a different technique to do that. But I think your question sort of illustrates the potential of this method to asking questions exactly such as those.
Brilliant, thank you, Anthony. Well, whilst we're on the potential, Anding, she who is listening in from the library and can't read her question out herself, says, I wonder whether mixed methods social analysis, along with the idea of development of knowledge communities, has the potential to become a new research evaluation indicator to measure knowledge contribution. So obviously there are, within CG, there are people interested in research on research. Could you see a use for this as a way of measuring knowledge contributions? Any thoughts on that?
We've been having conversations about that as a team. I do wish, Thomas had been able to be here today. He was unable, but these are, as a methodologist, he's interested in this specific question that Andine has raised, not just within education, but just social science broadly. He's been mentioning ideas about how can he refine the programming, how can it be more automated, where it can, the computer can go out and scrape the literature. I mean, much of this was all done by human hand, which is why the end date on this is 2017, 2018. And it brings to the point, the question that Glenn raised about AI and open science as well, is that we believe that there's a skeleton here for folks to use, and they can stand on our shoulders and take this much further than we've been able to do. But I do think that there's a skeleton here that that isn't a passing fad. Anthony, you want to, or Sheeny, you want to chime in?
I would just say that we were talking a little bit about this prior to the beginning of the seminar with David. I think Anding, you're very insightful in the potential to use this kind of method as an evaluation indicator, because you can you can think of different metrics based on citations and citation indices that can be derived from this kind of work. My colleague Dan McFarland has done something similar with co-citation networks by looking at contributions to ideas, looking at sort of the origin of ideas in scholars' dissertations and seeing which ones sort of flower and get taken up across time, and looking at the various characteristics of those authors, and actually seeing some stratification of sort of knowledge development there, right? And those can easily be turned into some sort of evaluation kind of indicator at any kind of contextual level, I think, not just regional as well. So we're very excited about what else can be done with this kind of work.
Perhaps the challenge is that as Michael Power put it, as soon as a measure becomes a target, or perhaps it was Marilyn Strathern actually think, but once a measure becomes a target, it's no longer a good measure. And that's clearly an issue for anyone who's trying to sort of do policy in higher education. That this is a great way of following and understanding science in its twists and turns. But if you then turn it into a way of assessing impact, then it can get weaponized, I guess, in the same way as we're now seeing citation cartels, for example. There's lots of debates in research integrity, aren't there, about people forcing others to cite their work in order to build the impact factor of a journal. So I mean, I think yes, I mean, but that's always going to be a problem, and I don't think that mitigates against the value of what you're doing here, which is to sort of make a much more sophisticated citation analysis, which is sort of, I think, as I was saying before, sort of what Garfield originally hoped his citation index would do, but then it got turned into a very instrumental way of measuring impact rather than a way of following knowledge as it developed. Glenn, did you want to come in, because you did raise the question around AI?
Well, let me just jump in if you can hear me. I do not know. Okay, thank you. Thanks, David, and thank you, dear panel. I think you guys have done a brilliant job, and I'm speaking to you from Thailand. Okay, so late in the evening, I've been kind of energized with my questions. The prospect of your research being evolutionary, I think, and tracing patterns thereby is fascinating as you go back to, I think you used the year 1974 and then spiraled towards 2017 with a very, very wide gap of literature reviews. And then, of course, you insert a degree of selectivity, which I appreciate. The question that I do have is, with national policies right now, really caught in the midstream between open science and AI, and then your study, which might as well become, kind of immaterial to measurements and citations and advancements of knowledge. Where would you place really the scope for, let's say, a wider international participation in the accountability matrices that you've been addressing? And number two, how would one look at the discriminators of the traditional knowledges and those knowledges generated from the generative and the open science platforms? Thank you.
Do you want to respond to that? I'll leave you to think about that for a second.
We've had conversations. I'll start, and then Anthony or Sheeny can chime in too. We've had conversations as a research team about what AI and open science mean for this specific research, as well as just the explosion of information, which was part of the reason why we've been also discussing about, is there a way that we can further automate this process now that we've gone in? Because if you can get a machine to do the data scrape for you, organize that, do the data management process, run it through the coding, and even to some extent the meaning-making processes. Because we're on the front end of this, we're doing all of this by hand. I mean, much of what we're able to show you is the result of people copying and pasting text excerpts out of PDFs, downloading PDFs, specific ones, drawing those parameters, learning what works, what doesn't work, and then being able to say, okay, now that we have been able to identify this skeleton, this structure, we can see that it can be deployed in other areas of knowledge, anthropology, history, sociology, education, broadly speaking, computer science. As information continues to explode, whether it's generated by a human or generated by a computer. I think it's important to be able to have these structures, to be able to deploy, and this is important, to make things manageable. Because right now, part of the reason the duration of this project has been this long is because you're looking at, human capital and human labor, pulling this off to build the structures that can be redeployed later. Those are my initial thoughts. Anthony or Sheeny, you want to offer yours?
Well, let me just get into, I think, similar questions by Glenn and Daniel here, and talk a little bit about the weaknesses. So I think with any kind of technique, analytical technique or algorithm, you are potentially limited or even sabotaged by bad data. The garbage in, garbage out kind of phenomenon. And with both sort of an explosion of open science and online publishing, and as we've seen, some sketchy, I will say, AI generated studies and that sort of thing, that places a huge onus on the researcher, no matter your method, but particularly here, if you can automate it, to having garbage data, artifactual kinds of results, nonsensical kinds of results, phantasmal kinds of results. That's a huge, huge limitation, right? And that again places a huge onus on the researcher, or might say the whole research community, to be vigilant and develop tools alongside ones like this one to sort that out. We don't have a great way to sort that out right now. And you can imagine how easy it is to produce poor work or phony kinds of work, and easily double the size of the corpus that we looked at here, and create communities that don't exist. So I think it's a cautionary tale that you both are raising here for a method such as this one.
Sheeny, you've been bearing the coding load for 12 months now, hours and hours a week. Do you have any thoughts about the questions that Glenn or Andine or Daniel has raised?
Well, I think as we discussed in the team meeting, it'll be really great to, it's really hard to look at all the references and articles and these complicated relationships among them. And, remember what this article was, how this article was referring, quoting this reference, and how this article was quoting this reference, and comparing them is very unmanageable, as you said. But I think it'll be really great to, when the data is complex, you tend to believe in your intuition when interpreting the data. And it'll be using AI will be a really great way to double check to see objectively what you're interpreting. And I think that's how AI could be used in this as a tool for this kind of a method.
That is right. We've been having those discussions of doing a side-by-side coding of, let's let AI code these items. Let's use our method, code the items. Are there differences between them? We've been having those types of discussions. I've been chewing on Daniel's question about weaknesses and limitations of our method. I've not come on anything at the moment. Anthony or Sheeny, does anything come to your mind?
Well, I mean, you can certainly, the focus on knowledge communities as we have constructed them is just another particular way to look at literature. And what comes with that are some blind spots as well. What we don't do here is apply strong sort of theoretical framings to the groupings of the literature. It's empirically derived through these co-citations. So, from the perspective of sort of identifying novel knowledge problems, and I think of as knowledge problems, it may not be the best tool to do that, right? It's better suited to look at the evolution of ideas. It's better suited to understand sort of knowledge production, spatially and temporally. And from those, you can derive knowledge problems, but knowledge problems of a certain kind, right? Likely related to the evolution. We've already talked about questions related to sort of the diffusion of knowledge, for example. But it may not see a whole host of other kinds of novel knowledge problems that are important for the field. So because it's a specific kind of framework that it's not designed to do all of that as well. So it will definitely have its own blind spots.
Sorry, Josh, go on, finish. Go on.
I was just going to say, related to Anthony's, we are empirically bound. So some of the questions that we have, David, you raised one of them. Anthony and Sheeny and I have talked about cross-pollination, relationship to the communities. And when that happens, we have to look to Tom and say, hey, how do we empirically make that happen with the data? So that's actually one of the limitations. So back to you, David.
Yeah, no, I was just reflecting on, I mean, in terms of understanding the evolution ideas, what was interesting about the community, some came from policy into academic. So that's interesting. Some start as a conceptual intervention. You see the emergence of newer ways of understanding or operationalizing a word like accountability in some ways that allows you to spot that, doesn't it? When there's a sort of whole new sort of anchor that's framing the debates, and so then it allows you to trace different genealogies of ideas. So I think there is a lot of potential here, and I think the geographies of knowledge is fascinating, isn't it? It's just how US debates stay in the US and how the rest of the world can have a conversation that's very separate from that. That's really interesting and important, and a reminder as well, isn't it, that actually having a global higher education conversation is really hard when you have such a lot of onus to sort of there's enough to do in understanding a large national system like the US and its incentives. Just to come back to the AI conversation, I think it would be very interesting for you to look at the ways in which, there's an integrity arms war going on. I'm sure you're aware of that in terms of research publishing, and AI tools are being deployed both to sort of try and keep up with that and to avoid being discovered. And so, obviously, the problematic paper spotter and those sorts of tools being developed by the research sleuths are trying to use things like tortured phrases to spot citation cartels and networks. And there's been quite a lot of interesting work on sort of fake citation making, I guess. And so what's also good about what you're doing here is you're not simply trying to create an integrity tool. You're actually genuinely, trying to look beyond a normative sort of, this is how things should be done, to actually just stand back and seeing the emergence of a concept and its sort of development over time. So I think there's lots of potential here, and yes, who knows whether you're going to be able to make lots of money out of it, like Garfield. I doubt you are, but but I think it's great to go back to sort of thinking about the ways in which Garfield's work, for example, just transformed the ways we think about measuring knowledge. And the importance of what he was originally imagining was tracing the flow of ideas, and that all got lost within this focus on the index. And he too was having to make all these compromises around which journals he put in the index, because he couldn't. As you say, the overflow of information is just so enormous. you have to sort of start somewhere. So look, I'm talking us out. I'm sorry, I hadn't realised that, but it's 3 p.m. in the UK. We've had some great questions. And sorry, Daniel, I didn't get you to come in. Perhaps I should give Daniel the last word. Daniel, did you have any last thoughts after your question about weaknesses?
This was go ahead.
Actually, can I answer to this short question really
Sure,
quick?
of course.
So
Yeah, sure.
Daniel asked previously if in relation to books by Bach, Martins and Rhodes, etc., were there some from Africa or by African authors such as Mandani work on scholars in the marketplace? I just checked the list of references of this community, and unfortunately there was no work by Mandami, and also most of the references were written by written about European universities or US higher education system.
Okay, and I mean, in some ways, that's another whole issue, isn't it? Which is that you had to choose some databases and indexes to start with, and inevitably there's probably a US bias in some of those, you know.
Yep.
So, but that's always going to be the way with sort of peripheral knowledge systems and keeping them in the loop.
Yeah.
Look, we probably ought to wrap up.
Yep.
This has been so interesting. Thank you all for coming, especially Anthony for getting up so early. Thank you, Glenn, for staying up so late. And everyone for questions. It's been, as always, a great conversation. So we'll post the slides and this recording tomorrow for those of you, and as a transcript who want to listen again or pass it on. Good luck with this work. Keep going with it, Anthony, Joshua, Sherry. I think it's really important, and we look forward to having you again soon. Next week we are turning our gaze on the US, and we are going to have a paper with John Aubrey Douglas, who's based at Berkeley, and it's called Trump's America: Higher Education and the Emergence of a Neo-Academic Cold War. So we go from the detailed methodology to the big picture. But please join us again and every week at 2 o'clock UK time. And for now, thanks again. Bye-bye, everyone.
Cheers.